After 24 years in the Army, I needed $20,000 for surgery. My son said he couldn't help. Days later, he was on vacation. My 23-year-old daughter sold her car to pay for it. My wife called me useless and filed for divorce. 5 months later, the VA paid me $541,000 they'd owed since 2013. 6 days after they took my hip out and put a titanium one in, I was on a couch in my own front room, and I could not get to the bathroom without somebody helping me. My wife was in the kitchen on the telephone with her sister, and she did not know how far a voice carries in that house. She said, "He just sits there. He's useless now, honestly." She was standing about 11 feet from me, on the other side of a wall I framed myself back in 2006. 5 months later, the government deposited $486,000 into my account, money they had owed me since I was 42 years old. If it had come in the fall instead of the spring, not one thing that follows ever happens. 26 years in the Army. I paid off their house, put both kids through school with no debt, bought them cars, and carried a mortgage that was never mine to carry. And I asked my son for $18,000 one time in 32 years. Tell me in the comments what you would have done with that money when it finally came, because I know what I did, and I have not been at peace with it for a single day since. Subscribe while you're down there. I put one of these up every day. Hit like on your way past. My name is Otis Kendrick, and I am 61 years old. 26 years in the Army. I came in 1985, and I came out in 2011 as a Master Sergeant. This is not a war story, and I am not that man. I ran motor transport. That means for 26 years I made sure other people's trucks ran. Convoy operations, maintenance sections, motor pools in 3 countries. I have signed for more equipment than most people will see in their whole lives, and I have never once fired a weapon at another human being. I say that because there's a version of a story like this where the man is a hero, and I was a mechanic in a uniform, and most of that army is men like me, and nobody makes a movie about us. I am from Killeen, Texas, and I live in Killeen, Texas, which is a thing about army towns that people from outside them do not understand. You come here at 19 for basic, and then 30 years later you are still here. I married Delene Ashwell in 1988. She was 22 and I was 24. We met at a wedding of 2 people neither of us has spoken to since sometime in the 90s. That woman moved 9 times for me. Fort Riley, Fort Stewart, Germany twice. The second time for 2.5 years with a 2-year-old in a house with no air conditioning. Fort Drum, back here twice. 9 moves in 18 years, and she never once made me feel bad about a single one of them. That's true, and it makes everything that came later something other than simple. I'll give you one of those moves. Germany, the second time. Baumholder. We had a 2-year-old and Simone was 5 months old, and the housing they gave us had no air conditioning and one of those windows that tips instead of opening. It was 92 degrees in August, and I was gone 11 days on an exercise. She put both of those babies in a bathtub of cool water twice a day for 11 days, in an apartment in a country where she didn't speak the language, and when I got back, she'd made the place look like somewhere people lived. She'd hung curtains. She'd found a rug at a flea market in a town whose name I still can't pronounce and carried it home on a train. I have thought about those 11 days a great deal in the last 2 years, and about the fact that the woman who did that is the same woman who stood on the other side of a wall in the spring, saying I was useless. I think I owe you more of the marriage itself before I go any further, because 26 years does not compress into a handful of sentences about a wall and a phone call. I met Delene Ashwell in the spring of 1988 at the wedding of a man named Curtis Boone, who I'd gone through AIT with, and a woman named Sharon who Delene had known since middle school. I was 24 and freshly assigned to my second duty station, and I did not know a single other person at that reception besides the groom. Delene sat down next to me at a table nobody else wanted, near the kitchen door, and told me within about 10 minutes that she had no intention of marrying a soldier because her own father had been Air Force and had missed most of her childhood, and she had watched what that did to her mother. I told her I understood completely, and I asked her to dance anyway, and she said yes, and I have never fully worked out whether that was a contradiction on her part or simply the truth working itself out in real time, the way truth sometimes does when a person says one thing and then does another because the first thing was really more a warning than decision. We married 8 months later. Her mother cried through the entire ceremony, and I found out years afterward that it wasn't happiness, or not only happiness, It was the same fear Darlene had named at that wedding table, watching her own daughter walk into the exact life she'd spent years warning her away from. I want to be fair to the woman I married, even now, because fairness matters to me, and the truth serves better than a story where she was simply cold from the very beginning. Darlene was, for most of those 26 years, exactly the wife she'd promised me she'd never be talked into being in the best possible sense. She ran a household through 9 moves without once falling apart in front of the children. She held 2 jobs during the years I was deployed and never once complained to me about it in a letter, because she said complaining to a man in a combat zone about a hard week at a title company felt like a waste of both our time. She showed up for 21 of those 26 years. Before the limp got bad, she showed up completely, and I do not want anything that came after to erase that from the record. We have 2 children. Trevor Kendrick is 32. Simone is 25. I want to tell you a little more about how those 2 children actually grew up different, because I'm going to give you the short version now and the long version matters later. Trevor was born when I was 29, 8 years into my career, at a point when things were still climbing, new stripes every few years, new responsibility, a young family that felt, from the inside, like a story with a clear upward direction. I coached his baseball team for 4 seasons. I made every single one of his school events I was in the country for, and I kept a written log, for years, of the ones I missed while deployed, because I did not want to lose track of what deployments actually cost him, even if he never saw that log himself. Simone came 3 years later, when things had leveled off some, when I was in E6 instead of climbing toward E5, when the excitement of a first child had settled into the ordinary rhythm of a second one. I do not say that to diminish her. I say it because it is true, and because I think it matters to how this all turned out. By the time Simone was old enough to really notice things, her father was a tired man in his late 30s with 2 kids and a mortgage and a body that had already, though none of us knew it yet, absorbed an injury that was quietly getting worse every single year. Trevor got a father who still believed, on some level, that hard work simply produced good outcomes, because that had been his own experience up to that point. Simone got a father who had started to understand that hard work sometimes just produces more hard work, and who passed that understanding to her, without ever meaning to, in 1,000 small moments of not quite having the energy to make things easy. Here is what I built, and I am going to lay it out in numbers, because numbers are the only honest way to say it. I paid off the house on Larkspur Street in 2013, 19 years on a VA loan, and I made the last payment 11 months after I retired, and I didn't tell anybody I'd done it until Christmas. Both of those children came out of school with 0 debt. There was a stretch in 2004 I have to describe, because it's a receipt on everything I just said. The economy did what it did, and Darlene lost a job she'd had at a title company here in town, and I was in E7 with 2 children and a mortgage. We did not exchange Christmas presents that year. Not between the 2 of us. The children had presents, and neither one of them ever knew a single thing was different. I did not miss a payment in 2004. Not 1 month. We ate a great deal of rice and beans, and I told my wife I wasn't hungry more than once. Trevor doesn't know that. Simone doesn't know that. Nobody knows that except a woman in Killeen who's married to somebody else now. I opened a college fund for Trevor in 1997, when he was 5, and one for Simone in 2000. I put money in both of them every single month for 18 years, including the year we didn't have it, including 2004, when Darlene and I didn't exchange Christmas presents because there was nothing to exchange them with. Trevor went to Texas A&M, Simone went to Baylor. Neither one of them has ever made a student loan payment in their lives, and neither one of them has ever thought about it for more than 4 seconds. That's exactly what I wanted, and I would do it again. I bought both of them a car outright at graduation. Not new, good, clean, low mileage, bought with cash, titled in their names. And in 2017, I co-signed Trevor's mortgage, $615,000, in a development off Whisper Creek in Round Rock. He was 28 and had been in pharmaceutical sales for 3 years and was making about $130,000, and he didn't qualify on his own. The lender said the word co-signer, and I said, all right. Then I started paying $2,350 a month toward that note. That was supposed to be for 1 year. That's what we said out loud at my own kitchen table. 1 year, until the commission structure changed and he got the territory he was in line for. It was 2 years and 9 months when it stopped, and I am going to tell you exactly how it stopped. Now the injury, because everything in my life comes out of about 4 seconds outside Kabul in 2004. We were on a logistics run. Nothing unusual about it. The lead vehicle hit an IED that had been in that road for some period of time. I was in the third truck. Nobody in my vehicle was killed. Nobody in my vehicle was seriously hurt. What happened to me is that the vehicle went over, and I went into the interior of it hip first, and then I got out of it and walked around for 2 hours doing my job. I had to be honest about the next part, because it's the whole reason my family fell apart. Nothing was broken. They looked at me. There was a medic, and then there was an aid station, and then there was an x-ray, and there was nothing on it. 10 days of light duty, and I was back on trucks. I walked away from it. That's a fact everything else grew out of. I walked away, and there's no story attached to it. And for years, when it came up, I said it was nothing. What actually happened was a labral tear and damage to the head of the femur that doesn't show on a plain film in 2004. My body spent the next 17 years compensating for it. Here's how that goes. And if there's a man listening to this who's 50 and telling himself is just getting old, listen to this part. 2006. My hip is stiff in the mornings. 2009. I have a limp, not every day, bad days. 2011. I retired a medical board, and the board is for my back and my hearing, and the hip is a line item. 2014. I can't stand at a cookout for more than about 20 minutes. I started sitting down at things. I started picking chairs. 2018. I can't put my own socks on some mornings without sitting on the edge of the bed and doing a thing with my foot. There are 2 days in there I want to put in, because a limp is not a scene, and this is what it actually costs. Simone's college graduation, May of 2015, at an arena in Waco. You park a long way from those buildings. It was about a quarter mile from where we ended up, and I made it about 200 yards, and then I told my wife I'd left something in the car. I had not left anything in the car. I sat in a parking garage on a concrete barrier for about 9 minutes, and then I walked the rest of it, and I got there, and I saw my daughter walk. Darlene knew. She never said a word about it, and I have wondered since whether that was kindness or whether it was the first entry on a list. The second one was 2017. Trevor asked me to help him move into that house off Whisper Creek. I said yes, and then I sat in a rented truck outside that house for almost 4 hours while my son and 2 of his friends carried furniture past me. I was 54 years old. At one point I got out and carried a lamp. A lamp, that's what I carried. Trevor said, "Dad, sit down. We've got it." He was being kind. He was absolutely being kind. In the summer of 2022, an orthopedic surgeon at a practice on Bunker Hill Drive put an image up on a screen and said, "Mr. Kendrick, there's no cartilage left in this joint. There hasn't been for probably 3 years. You've been walking bone on bone." He said, "How are you doing this?" I said, "I don't know. I just do it." The Army rated me at 20% for that hip in 2006. 20%. Based on range of motion measured on one afternoon when I was 42 years old and could still do most things. That rating never changed. It sat there for 17 years while the joint deteriorated, and I didn't appeal it because I didn't know you could and because I was 42 and didn't consider myself disabled. Understand what that number does. At 20% service-connected for a hip, when I needed a total hip replacement in 2022, the VA classified it as degenerative joint disease rather than a service-connected condition requiring surgical intervention. Denied. I appealed the denial, and the appeal was denied. The surgery at the practice on Bunker Hill Drive quoted out at $58,000. I had about $17,500 in savings and a paid-off house. That is where this starts. That is the whole thing. $58,000. I asked my son for help in August of that year. I have gone over that conversation about 300 times, and I'm going to give it to you as close to exact as I can. He came to the house on a Saturday. He came because I asked him to, and he hadn't been to Killeen in about 5 months, which I had noticed and hadn't said anything about. We sat on the back porch, and I told him what the surgeon said, and what the VA said, and what the number was. I did not ask him for $58,000. I asked him for 18. I had 17.5 in savings. Simone had said she'd find something. I had a line of credit I could get about 9,000 on. I needed 18 from him, and I told him I'd pay it back over 2 years, and I told him I'd put it in writing. My son said no. He didn't say no. That's the thing. He never said the word. He talked for about 10 minutes about the market. He talked about how the whole industry had gotten tight and how his numbers were down against a quota that had been raised. He talked about liquidity, which is a word my son used on my back porch. He said, "Dad, everything I have is in the house." I said, "All right." He said, "And honestly, the timing is terrible because Q3 is when it all comes in and right now I'm carrying a lot." I said, "All right, Trevor." He said, "Can it wait? Is it the kind of thing that can wait 6 months?" I said, "The man says the joint is gone." My son said, "Right, but they always say that." Then he stayed for lunch and we talked about the Cowboys. That's the part that has stayed with me longer than the number. He stayed. He ate a sandwich his mother made, and he was in that house for another hour and change, and he was good company, and he hugged me at the truck and said he loved me, and he meant it. A man can decline to help his father get out of a chair and then be pleasant about football for an hour, and there's no crack in him anywhere. That's what I could not stop looking for afterward. I kept going back over that lunch looking for the seam. There isn't one. 12 days later, he was in Tulum. I didn't go looking for that. Nobody sent it to me. It came up on my own phone in the ordinary way, and I was sitting in a waiting room of the surgeon's office on Bunker Hill Drive at the time. I was in that waiting room because I'd gone in to ask about a payment plan. I know it was 12 days because he posted it. 4 days at a place on the water, and there's a photograph of that boy at a table with 3 other people and a bottle and an ice bucket on it. I didn't say anything about that, and I have never said anything about that, and I have thought about it every single day for 2 years. Simone sold her car. I didn't know about that for 11 months. She told me she had savings from a job she'd had in college and that she wanted to help and wouldn't take no. She was 23 years old and making about $43,000 a year at a nonprofit in Austin doing development work. She sat at my kitchen table and lied to my face very convincingly for about 6 minutes. The car was a 2015 Corolla I bought her for graduation. Cash, clean title, 38,000 miles. She sold it in September that year for $8,700. Then she took a personal loan for the rest of it at 15.9%, which is what a 23-year-old with no collateral and a nonprofit salary gets offered. She bought a Ford Focus for $1,900 off a lot on the edge of town, and it broke down twice inside the first month. She drove that thing to work every day and never said one word about it to me. I found out in October because a loan statement came to my house. She'd used my address on the application because she'd been between apartments. I opened it because I opened my own mail. I sat at that table with a piece of paper from a lender in Austin in my hand, and I did the arithmetic, and then I went out to the garage, and I could not come back inside for about 40 minutes. I have to say how the $58,000 actually got paid, because I've skipped it and it matters. $17,500 of it was my savings. That was everything I had that wasn't the house. $8,700 was a car in Austin I didn't know about. $5,400 went on 2 credit cards belonging to a 23-year-old that I didn't know about either. $24,200 was a personal loan at 15.9% in my daughter's name. 0 came from my son. 0 came from my wife, who had a job at a dental office and an account of her own she'd been putting into since 2018, which came out in the divorce and which had about $28,000 in it that October. I didn't ask her. I never asked Aline for that money, and I thought about why, and the answer is that by August I already knew what the answer would be, and I didn't want to hear it out loud from my wife. The surgery was on the 9th of October. It went fine. Total hip replacement, anterior approach. 1 night in the hospital, and I was home the next afternoon. I want to describe the first 2 weeks, because it's where everything ended. You cannot do anything. That's the part people don't understand about a hip. It isn't pain. It's that your body will not obey you. You cannot bend past 90 degrees for 6 weeks. You cannot put on your own socks. You cannot get off a couch that's too low. And my couch is too low. I could not get off it without somebody putting a hand under my arm. For 6 days, that somebody was Deline, and she did it. She did all of it, and she did not complain to my face one single time, and I need that in here. She helped me to the bathroom. She washed me. She put a chair in the shower, and she was in there with me. I'm 61 years old, and I have never in my life been more embarrassed than I was in that shower on a Wednesday morning in October. On the 6th day, she was in the kitchen on the telephone with her sister Dolores. The kitchen is on the other side of the front room, and there's a wall between them. And I framed that wall myself in 2006 when we redid that part of the house, and I know exactly how sound moves in it. And she did not. She said, "No, he's fine. He's on the couch." Then she said, "He just sits there. He's useless now, honestly." Then she said something else I didn't catch. And then she laughed. I need to be exact about the laugh, because it's a whole thing. It wasn't a cool laugh. My wife is not a cruel woman, and she wasn't making fun of me to her sister on a Wednesday afternoon. It was a laugh a person makes when they said something true that they've been carrying around, and somebody on the other end has agreed with them. It was relief. That's what I heard through that wall. Not contempt. Relief. From a woman who'd been thinking a thing for about 2 years and had finally said it out loud to somebody who didn't argue. She laughed. I lay on that couch and looked at a ceiling I put up, and I didn't say anything to that woman about it that day, or the next day, or ever. She filed for divorce on the 25th of October, 16 days after the surgery, 10 days after that phone call. I could not drive. I could not sit in a normal chair for more than about 20 minutes. I had a walker in my front room. A man from a process-serving company came to my door on a Friday afternoon, and I answered it on a walker, and he apologized to me, and I told him it wasn't his fault, and I've thought since that he probably has that conversation a lot. Darlene was at work. That's how it was arranged, and I understood that immediately, and I have never held it against her, because there is no good way to be in a house when that happens. She came home at 5:30 and made dinner, and neither one of us said anything about it until about 8, and then she said, "Did it come?" I said, "It came." She said, "Okay." That was the conversation. 26 years. She moved out 3 weeks later, on a Saturday, and her sister Dolores came with a van, and I sat in the backyard in a lawn chair for 4 hours because I couldn't carry anything and I couldn't watch it either. There's one thing about that phone call I have to add, because it's a thing that turned a bad sentence into the end of a marriage. She said it to her sister. Dolores has known me since 1997. That woman has been at every Thanksgiving. She was in the delivery room in 2000 when Simone came. She cried at my retirement ceremony in 2011 and hugged me and said she was proud of me. And on a Wednesday afternoon in October, my wife told her sister I was useless, and her sister did not say one word back. I know that because there was no pause. Darlene said it, and then she said something else, and then she laughed. And a person who has been contradicted does not move that fast. Dolores called me once, about 8 months after divorce was final, which surprised me enough that I almost didn't answer. She said she wasn't calling to explain herself or to take sides, and then she spent about 10 minutes doing exactly that, in the careful way people do when they are trying not to look like they are doing it. I want you to know I didn't agree with what she said that day. Dolores told me. I laughed because I didn't know what else to do, sitting on the phone with my sister who sounded relieved for the first time in 2 years. I wasn't laughing at you, Otis. I was laughing because she finally sounded like herself again, and I didn't stop to think about what that relief was actually built on. I told her I appreciated the call. I meant it, mostly, but I also understood, listening to her, that she was asking me to separate an action from its cause in a way I was no longer willing to do for anybody, including myself. A person can have an understandable reason for a laugh and still be the reason that laugh landed as hard as it did. I've stopped needing every person in this story to be simply good or simply bad. Dolores is somewhere in the middle, same as the rest of us, and I've decided that's allowed to be true without requiring me to feel any particular way about her going forward. So it wasn't one sentence in one bad week. It was a thing those two women had said to each other before, and it had a shape already, and I was hearing about the 40th version of it through a wall. She had been seeing a man from her church for about 2 years. His name is Gareth Loomis, and he's 60, and he sells insurance, and he had been at my house. He was at Simone's graduation party. He shook my hand at a cookout in my own backyard and complimented the brisket. I found that out in December from Dolores, of all people, who told Simone, who didn't want to tell me and told me anyway, because she's the only person in that family who has ever told me anything. 2 years. That means it started around the time the limp was getting bad and before it got worse. I have had 2 years to think about what that means, and I've landed somewhere I don't enjoy. I don't think Darlene Kendrick left me for that man. I think that woman was 56 years old and had moved 9 times and had spent 5 years watching her husband slow down. And somewhere around then she made a decision about the next 30 years. And she found somebody. And then she waited. She waited until that hip was fixed. That's what I cannot get around. She could have gone the year before. She could have gone in the spring before any of it. She stayed through the diagnosis and the denial and the appeal and the surgery. She washed her husband in the shower on a Wednesday morning, and then she filed 16 days later. I have decided that was not cruelty. I think she believed she owed me the surgery, and that once she'd given it to me, the debt was clear. She got me through it, and then she left, and in her head, those two things go together and make her a decent person. That's worse. I want somebody to understand why that is worse. The divorce ran 19 months. Texas doesn't require a full year of separation the way some states do, but ours ran long anyway, mostly because there was a house to sell and a pension to divide, and neither attorney was in any hurry, and then the property questions got tangled up further once the VA money entered the picture the following spring. We ran that clock from the 25th of October. I moved into a rental on Cedar Knob Road in November because I could not stay in that house, and I was 60 years old with a walker in a 2-bedroom rental with a card table for a kitchen table. November and December of that year were the 2 worst months of my life. I have a friend named Ellis Cordoza, retired out the same year I did, same post, though he'd been infantry and I'd been wrenches, and we'd known each other since Fort Riley, which is longer than I'd known almost anyone still living in Killeen. Ellis showed up at that rental about 10 days after I moved in, unannounced, with a folding chair under one arm because he said he wasn't going to sit on a card table stool like a man visiting a stranger. "I'm not going to ask what happened," he said, setting the chair up across from mine in that empty living room. "I figure you'll tell me when you're ready, if you're ever ready. But I've known you since 1990, and I want you to know I'm 3 streets over, and I don't sleep much anyway, so call whatever hour it is." I took him up on that exactly twice, both times past midnight. Both times him showing up in sweatpants with 2 cups of gas station coffee and no questions attached to either visit. He'd just sit with me on that porch, or what passed for a porch of that rental, and let the quiet be the whole conversation. I don't know that I fully appreciated, at the time, what a rare thing that actually is, a man willing to simply occupy space next to you without needing to fill it with anything. I want to be honest that the rental period itself, separate from any single event inside it, did something to me that I have not fully worked my way out of, even now. There is a particular loneliness in being 60 years old in a 2-bedroom rental with furniture you bought secondhand because you didn't want to fight over the good pieces, eating dinner most nights standing at the counter because sitting down alone at a table built for more people than you felt like a decision you didn't want to keep making twice a day. I lost about 15 pounds that winter without trying to. I stopped answering the phone for people I didn't specifically want to talk to, which was most people. Ellis Cordoza was one of about 3 exceptions. I want to tell you about physical therapy too, because 6 weeks of it happened almost entirely during that stretch, and it deserves its own mention. Simone drove me to every appointment she could manage around her work schedule, which was about half of them. The other half, I drove myself, one-handed on the wheel some mornings because the other arm was still favoring the surgical side, gripping that steering wheel at 10 and 2 like a new driver instead of a man who'd driven convoy vehicles across 3 countries. My physical therapist, a patient young woman named Grace Whitlock, worked with me twice a week for the better part of 2 months, and somewhere around week 4, she told me something I've thought about since. "Most of my patients your age have somebody in the waiting room," she said, watching me struggle through a set of resistance exercises. "A spouse, usually, sitting right there the whole time." I told her my situation had changed recently. She didn't push for details, just nodded and said, "Then you're doing this part harder than most people have to. I want you to know I see that." It was a small thing to say, professionally kind rather than personal, but it landed at exactly the moment I needed somebody, anybody, to acknowledge that I was doing a genuinely difficult thing without the support most people in my position would have had. Word travels in a town like this one, the way it does in any place small enough that half the people at the commissary know your business before you fully process it yourself. I heard, secondhand, through Ellis, that some of Trevor's old high school friends who'd stayed in the area had their own opinions about what happened, and that most of those opinions did not favor my son. I did not go looking for that information, and I did not particularly enjoy receiving it, because I do not want my son's failures turned into entertainment for people who knew him at 17 and think they understand him at 32. I also heard, from a woman at church I barely know, that she'd heard the whole story about Deline and Gareth, and wanted me to know she thought it was disgraceful. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I appreciated her concern, and that I decided a while back not to need strangers' verdicts on my own marriage to feel settled about it myself. She looked a little surprised, and I understood why. Most people telling a story like this one want the audience fully on their side, villains clearly marked, applause in the right places. I am not entirely sure I want that anymore. I think I just want it told accurately, and let people arrive wherever their own lives lead them to arrive. Simone came every weekend, every single one, from Austin, an hour and change each way, in a $1,900 car she bought because she'd sold Hayes to pay for my hip and hadn't told me. Trevor came 4 times across those 19 months, once at Christmas for about 4 hours, once in March for a thing about his mother's storage unit, and twice more, briefly, in between. He called about every 3 weeks, and the calls were about 10 minutes, and he was pleasant on all of them. And on the first of every single month, $2,350 left my account and went to a mortgage servicer in Ohio for a house in Round Rock with my son's name on it. I want to tell you about that first Christmas, because I mentioned it only in passing just now, and it deserves more than that. Simone came, of course. She drove up on the 23rd and stayed 3 days, and she cooked in a kitchen that wasn't built for cooking and on a stove that came with a rental and that I never once figured out how to properly calibrate, and she never once complained about any of it. Trevor's visit on the day itself lasted about 4 hours total, and I want to add one detail I left out. He brought a gift, a nice one, a watch, something he clearly put real thought and real money into, and I opened it in that rental living room with a walker parked next to my chair, and I thanked him, and I meant it, and I have still never worn that watch, not once, and I cannot fully tell you why, except that it felt, somehow, like it belonged to a version of our relationship that had already ended by the time I unwrapped it. Deline was not there, obviously, for the first Christmas in 26 years. I found myself, on Christmas Eve, standing in that rental small kitchen at around 9 at night, having sent Simone to bed early because she looked exhausted from the drive, simply standing there in the quiet, and I realized I did not know what to do with an evening that had no tasks left in it. 26 years of a household means 26 years of somebody always needing something from you in the evening. A dish dried, a child settled, a wife to talk to about the day. I stood in that kitchen with nothing left to do and no one left to do it for, and I understood, more clearly than I had at any other point in that whole ordeal, exactly how much of a marriage is simply logistics dressed up as love, and how strange it is to have all the logistics disappear at once while the love, complicated as it had become, apparently had nowhere left to go. I kept paying it through all of it, through the divorce, through the rental, through the card table. I have been asked why by 4 different people, and the honest answer is that I could not work out how to stop without it being a statement, and I was not ready to make a statement. There is a longer answer, and it is worse. $2,350 a month was the last thing connecting me to that young man. If I stopped it, we would have had nothing. No reason to call. No mechanism. There's a version of a father and a 32-year-old son in this country where the entire relationship is a bank transfer on the first of the month, and I was in it, and I knew I was in it, and I kept paying because a transfer was better than nothing. That is the truth, and I have not enjoyed sitting with it. Now the appeal, and this is where it turns. In February of that same year, before any of the rest of it, I had filed a claim for increase with the VA on that hip. I did it because a man at the VFW post on Rancia Avenue named Sherman Odom looked at my paperwork one afternoon and said, "Otis, who rated you at 20%? I said, "That's what they gave me in 2006. He said, "And what year did you say you can't put your socks on?" Sherman Odom is 76 years old and did 2 tours in Vietnam, and he sits in a room at that post 3 days a week at a folding table with a laptop his grandson set up for him. He doesn't get paid. He is accredited through a veteran service organization and has been doing it since 1999, and by his own count has filed about 1,000 claims. I have been going into that building for 8 years. 8 years of walking past a folding table with a sign on it that said Veteran Service Officer, and I never once stopped. I was going in there for the bar. Sherman is a Veteran Service Officer. Those exist. They are free, and about 1 in 10 veterans in this country knows it. He filed that claim for me in February, And he did it properly. 17 years of imaging. The surgeon's records. A statement from my old first sergeant about the rollover outside Kabul. My own statement. And then he did the thing that made all the difference, and that I did not understand at the time. He also filed for TDIU, total disability, based on individual unemployability. That's a designation for a veteran who cannot maintain substantially gainful employment because of service-connected conditions, and it pays at the 100% rate regardless of the scheduler rating. I said, "Sherman, I'm not unemployable. I don't work because I retired." He said, "When did you last stand up for a full day?" I could not answer him. I sat at that folding table and tried to think of the last time I'd been on my feet for 8 hours, and I could not get to a year. He said, "That's what I thought." Then he said something I have repeated to about 9 different men since. He said, "The VA is not going to come to your house and tell you they've got you wrong. That's not a thing that happens. Somebody has to walk in here and ask." I should tell you more about Sherman Odom, because he changed my life more than almost anyone else in it, and I have given him only a few sentences so far. Sherman did 2 tours in Vietnam, 1968 and 1970, and came home to a country that did not want to look at him, in his own words, for about 15 years. He worked at a tire plant for 26 years after that, raised 4 children, and did not start volunteering as a veteran service officer until his own claim, filed in 1999 with help from a man who has since passed, finally came through after decades of being rated far below what his actual injuries warranted. He told me once that he decided, sitting in that same VFW hall the day his own decision came through, that he was not going to let another man his age go through what he'd gone through simply because nobody had ever told him the door existed. He has been sitting at that folding table 3 days a week for 25 years. He does not get paid. He has, by his own count, filed somewhere over 1,000 claims, and he keeps a small spiral notebook, not on the computer, in his own handwriting, with a single line for every veteran he has ever helped, first name, and a number representing however many months or years their claim had been wrong before he found them. My line in that notebook says, Otis, 17 years. I saw it once, by accident, when he had it open on the table between us, and I asked him how many other names in there had numbers that high. He looked at me for a second and said, "More than I'd like to tell you, Otis. That's exactly why I keep coming in." What Sherman put in that file is the reason it worked, and it was not luck. 17 years of imaging, which I did not know I had, every X-ray and every MRI from 2006 forward, pulled from 3 different systems. He did all of that with release forms and a fax machine. The operative report from October, which showed what was actually in that joint when they opened it, which is a different category of evidence than a picture of it, and a buddy statement from my old first sergeant, a man named Boyd Ratcliffe, who was in Mississippi and who I had not spoken to since 2018. Sherman tracked him down. I did not ask him to. He found a man in Mississippi and got him to write 2 paragraphs about a vehicle rollover outside Kabul in 2004 and sign it in front of a notary. Boyd Ratcliffe called me after he mailed it, first time in 6 years, and he said, "Kendrick, I did not know you got hurt in that." I said, "I did not either." I want to tell you a little more about that call, because 6 years of silence broken by 2 paragraphs about a rollover is not nothing, and I've thought about it more than I initially let on. Boyd was my first sergeant for the back half of that deployment, a hard, quiet man who did not waste words even when words were free. We had lost touch the ordinary way 2 Army friends lose touch, a few Christmas cards, then none, then a change of phone number neither of us bothered chasing down. When he called me after mailing that statement to Sherman, the first thing he said, before hello, before anything, was, "Kendrick, why didn't you tell me you got hurt in that truck?" I told him the truth. I told him I didn't know, myself, for most of the years in between. He was quiet on the line for a long moment, and then he said something that has stayed with me since. I checked on every man in that convoy the week it happened. Every single one. I signed off that nobody was hurt because that's what the paperwork said, and that's what you told me yourself, standing right there with dust still on you. He paused. I've thought about that report for years. Kendrick, wondering if I missed something. I didn't miss anything. You just didn't know yet what you were standing on. We talk now, every couple of months, the way men our age talk, mostly about nothing, mostly about trucks and grandchildren and whichever team is disappointing us that particular season. But there's a weight underneath those calls now that wasn't there before, a shared understanding that neither one of us fully processed something at the time it actually happened, and that it took a stranger with a folding table and a laptop to make either one of us go back and look at it properly. The claim was denied in June. The appeal was filed in July. It sat for 20 months. 20 months is October through the following June of the year after. I want to put those months side by side with what else was happening, because the two of them ran at the same time, and neither one knew about the other. October, the surgery, the couch, the wall. November, served and moved into a rental. December, found out about Gareth Loomis. February, mediation. August, I open a loan statement addressed to my daughter. October, the divorce hearing on property. Following June, divorce final. And the entire time, in a building in Washington, a file with my name on it was in a queue. I want to describe one moment from that February mediation, because it stayed with me longer than most of the actual substance. We sat across a conference table from each other, Darlene and me, each with our own attorney, a mediator between us going through a checklist of assets, the house, the retirement accounts, the furniture, all of it reduced to line items on a legal pad. About halfway through, we hit a line for a set of dishes Darlene's grandmother had left her, worth almost nothing financially, and the mediator asked, as a formality, whether there was any dispute about who kept them. "They are mine," Darlene said, quickly, defensively, as though I might actually contest a set of chipped floral china I had never once expressed any interest in during 26 years of marriage. "I know they're yours, Darlene," I said. "I never once thought they were anything but yours." She looked at me for a second, and something in her face went soft, just for that one moment, the way it used to when we were young and one of us said something the other didn't expect. Then the mediator moved on to the next line item, and the moment closed, and we went back to being two people dividing up a life with lawyers doing the talking. But I have thought about that exchange more than almost any other single minute of that whole process, because it was the last time, in 19 months of negotiations, that either one of us sounded like the people who used to actually know each other. There's one more specific afternoon I want to put in from around that same stretch, because I think it belongs next to it. I went to a hardware store on a Saturday that same February to buy a part for a leaking faucet, something I would have handled myself in 20 minutes for 30 years running, and I stood in that aisle for what felt like a long time, simply unable to figure out how I was going to crouch down to look at the pipe fittings without something in my hip giving out entirely. A young employee, maybe 19, noticed me standing there and asked if I needed help finding something. I told him what I needed, and he crouched down himself and read me the part numbers off the shelf, and I stood there, 60 years old, unable to do a task I had done 1,000 times, needing a teenager in a store apron to be my knees. I bought the part. I drove home. I sat in my truck in that rental's driveway for a while before I went inside, because I did not want Simone, who was visiting that weekend, to see my face right after that particular errand. Nobody was doing anything wrong. That's the part that's hard to be angry about. It was in line. My marriage ended and my daughter went into debt, and my son said no to me, all of it inside the 20 months that a file was in line. That is not unusual. That is completely ordinary, and every veteran listening already knows it, and everybody else needs to hear it. 20 months is not a scandal. 20 months is a Tuesday. The decision came on the 11th of March. Sherman called me. He got it before I did, because he's my representative of record, and it hit his portal first. He said, "Otis, are you sitting down?" I said, "I'm always sitting down, Sherman." He said, "They granted it 100%, and they granted TDIU, and it's retroactive." I said, "Retroactive to when?" Sherman Odom said, "To your original effective date, 2006. The deposit was $486,000 and some change. That's 17 years of the difference between what they paid me at 20% and what they should have been paying me, plus the TDIU rate running from my medical retirement in 2011. It is not a settlement. Nobody sued anybody. There is no defendant. It is money the United States government owed me since I was 42 years old, and had not paid, because a man measured my range of motion on one afternoon and put a number on a form. I sat in a rental house on Cedar Knob Road and looked at a bank application on a telephone. I did not celebrate, People assumed there was a moment, and there was not. I put the phone face down on a card table. Then I got up and washed 2 dishes that were in the sink, and I wiped the counter, and I stood at the window of a rented kitchen looking at a driveway. Then I sat back down and picked the phone back up and looked at it again, because a part of me thought I had read it wrong. $486,000. And the only thing in my head was a date. The 9th of October. And the only thing I could think about, the only thing, was the 9th of October, 5 months earlier. If that decision had come in October the year before instead of March of this one, I write a check for $58,000 and nothing else happens. My daughter does not sell her car. My daughter does not sign a personal loan at 15.9% at 23 years old. I do not sit on a back porch and ask my son for $18,000 and get 10 minutes about liquidity. And I do not know whether my wife files or does not file. And I am never going to know that. And it is the one piece of this I would actually like an answer to. Every single thing that broke my family broke inside a 5-month window over $58,000, while $486,000 sat in an appeals queue in Washington with my name on it. Let me stop for 1 second because we are coming up on the part 1 I've never said out loud in one piece. If you are still here, subscribe. I put a new one of these up every single day. Hit the like button on your way past and tell me this in the comments because I have never worked it out. She got me through that surgery and then filed 16 days later, and I think she believes she had done the right thing by me. Is a person like that cruel, or are they something else? I read every single one of them. Darlene found out about the money in April. I did not tell her. Nobody in that family told her. Sherman filed a form with the VA changing my dependent status because we were separated, and something in that system generated a notice, and her attorney got a copy. She came after it. Her attorney filed a motion in May to reopen the equitable distribution portion of the case, on the theory that a retroactive payment covering the period of the marriage was marital property. And here is where a woman found out what a document actually says. My attorney is a woman named Yvette Solano, here in Killeen, who does about 80% military divorces and has been doing it since 2001. She filed a 4-page response, and I sat in that courtroom in June and watched the judge explain it to Darlene's attorney in about 9 minutes. Federal law says VA disability compensation is not divisible marital property. It cannot be divided in a divorce, not the monthly payment, and not a retroactive award, because a retroactive award is compensation for disability, not deferred earnings. There is a Supreme Court case about it, and there is a federal statute, and there is not any argument. Her attorney knew that. I am certain her attorney knew that in May and filed anyway because the client insisted. I want to give you a fuller account of that day, because I compress it more than it deserves. Yvette had warned me, walking in, that Darlene's attorney would likely argue hardship, that a woman who'd spent 26 years as military spouse, much of it unable to build her own retirement or seniority at any single job because of the moves, deserved some consideration beyond the letter of the federal statute. It was, I'll admit, not an unreasonable argument to make, even if it was legally doomed from the start. The judge, a measured woman named Patricia Ainsley, who I understood handled the majority of the county's military divorces, let both attorneys make their full case before she said a word. Then she spoke for about 9 minutes, plainly, the way a person explains something to someone they don't think is being deliberately difficult, just genuinely mistaken. She cited the federal statute. She cited the Supreme Court case. She said, gently, that she understood the appeal of the argument, and that she was nonetheless bound by law that Congress had written with exactly the situation in mind, protecting disability compensation from exactly the kind of claim being made in her courtroom that morning. Darlene's attorney thanked the court and did not appeal the ruling further. I have wondered since whether that was his own judgment about the odds, or whether it was Darlene herself, in the end, deciding she didn't actually want to keep fighting for money that had never been hers to begin with. There is a thing that happened in that courtroom before the ruling that I have not been able to put down. We came in at the same time, not together. She came in the other door with her attorney, and I came in with Yvette, and there's a hallway on that floor where both doors let out, and for about 4 seconds the two of us were standing 11 feet apart in a hallway. Darlene said, "Hey, Otis." Just that, the way she has said it about 10,000 times in 26 years. "Hey, Otis." And I said, "Hey." 26 years of marriage and 2 children and 9 moves, and that is the entire content of the last conversation I had with that woman in a hallway on the 3rd floor of the Bell County Courthouse. Then we went into a room where a judge explained to her that she was not entitled to my disability compensation. I watched Delene's face while the judge said it. She was sitting 11 feet from me in a blue jacket I bought her in Germany in 2004. And what went across that woman's face was not disappointment. It was arithmetic. And I know the difference because I watched her do arithmetic at a kitchen table for 18 years about money we did not have. She was recalculating in real time in a courtroom at 56 years old. The divorce was final on the 11th of June. She got half the equity in a house that was paid off, which is a real number, and which I do not begrudge her $1 of, because that woman moved 9 times and she earned every cent of that house. She did not get 1 penny of $486,000. I stopped paying my son's mortgage on the 1st of the following month. I did not announce it. I did not call him and explain. I logged into a bank on the 29th and I canceled a recurring transfer, and it took about 11 seconds. 2 years and 9 months. $77,000, if anybody is counting. And I counted. He called me on the 4th. He said, "Hey, I think something happened with the transfer." I said, "No." He said, "What?" I said, "Nothing happened with it. I stopped it." There was a pause on that telephone. Then my son said, "Okay." Then he said, "Is everything all right? Are you okay for money?" That is the first question that man asked. "Is your father all right for money?" I said, "I'm fine, Trevor." He said, "Okay, well, is this permanent or is this a cash flow thing? Because I need to plan." I said, "It's permanent." He said, "That's $23.50 a month." I said, "I know exactly what it is." Then I said the only hard thing I said to my son in that entire conversation. I said, "You told me on my back porch that everything you had was in that house. I have been the thing that was in that house. Now it's you." And I hung up. There were 4 weeks after that call, and I did not hear from him at all. Simone did. She told me later that her brother called her 3 times in that stretch, and that 2 of those calls were about me, and one of them was about whether she thought Dad was all right, meaning mentally. That is a thing people do. When a man finally says no after 32 years, the first explanation everybody reaches for is that something is wrong with him. She told him nothing was wrong with me. She said, "Trevor, he asked you for $18,000 in August and you went to Mexico." She told me her brother was quiet for a second and then said, "That's not fair," and changed the subject. He came to Killeen on the 6th of September. I knew he was coming. He texted the day before and asked if he could come by, and I said yes. I sat in that rental on Cedar Knob Road for 24 hours knowing what was walking through the door. He looked bad. He'd lost weight and he hadn't slept, and my son is a man who takes care of how he looks, and he hadn't shaved. He sat on the couch in that rental and said he was in trouble. The house was listed. He'd listed it in August, and it had been sitting for 3 weeks in a market that had gotten soft, and he'd bought at the top and owed more than the listing price. He said he had a credit card situation. He used the word situation. Then he said, "I heard about the VA thing." I said, "From who?" He said, "Simone mentioned it." Simone did not mention it. I asked her afterward, and she went white and said she had never said one word to her brother about my money, and I believe her, and I think Delene told him, and I have not asked. Then my son said the thing he came to say. He said, "Dad, I know I handled the surgery thing wrong. I was in a bad spot, and I didn't understand how serious it was, and I should have found a way, and I'm sorry." Then he said, "And I wouldn't ask, except I'm about $9,500 short of getting out from under this house without it going to foreclosure." $9,500. I sat in a chair across from my son and did an arithmetic I did not want to do. Here it is. I asked him for $18,000, and he gave me 10 minutes about liquidity, and then he flew to Chulum. He is asking me for 9.5. I said no. I did not make a speech. I have thought about that a great deal, and I am glad of it, because everything I had to say would have been for me. I said, "No, son." He said, "Dad," and I said, "I've got nothing else for you today." He sat there for about 11 seconds, and then he stood up and said, "So that's it?" I said, "That's it for now." He stopped at the door and said, "Was it the trip?" I said, "What?" He said, "Mexico. Was that it? Because I booked that in June. Dad, it was paid for before you ever asked me." That is true. I checked afterward, which I am not proud of. He booked it on the 11th of June, and I asked him for money on the 19th of August. I said, "Trevor, I know when you booked it." He said, "Then what?" I said, "You were sitting at a table in Mexico with a bottle of wine and a bucket on the 2nd of September, and I was on a couch, and I had asked you 2 weeks earlier, and you told me everything you had was in your house." He said, "I couldn't have gotten a refund." I said, "I know that too." Then I said the last thing I said to my son that day. I said, "You didn't have to cancel a trip. You had to think about me while you were on it, and you didn't, and that's not something a person can go back and do." He left. He didn't slam anything, and he didn't say anything ugly. He got in his car and drove back to Round Rock. The house went to a short sale in November. He's renting a place off the interstate now. He's called 4 times since September. I've taken 2 of them. Both of those calls were about 10 minutes, and both of them were pleasant, and neither one contained an apology or a request. And I have come to understand that he is doing the thing he thinks re-establish a relationship, which is to be normal at me until enough time has gone by. He's going to keep doing that. He's 32, and it has always worked before. The 2 I didn't take were in October, and I didn't take them because I was not in condition to be pleasant back, and I would rather not answer than be short with my son on a telephone. That is where it is. That is a whole current status, and it is not resolved, and I do not know what it turns into. Now, Simone, and this is the part one I've been working up to. I found that loan statement in October, 5 months before the money came. I did not tell her I knew, and the order matters. For 5 months, I knew that my daughter had sold her car and taken a loan at 15.9% and had been driving a $1,900 Focus to work in Austin, and I did not have the money to fix it. I did not tell her I knew, because there was nothing I could do except make her feel found out. That was the worst 5 months. Not the divorce. Not the couch. 5 months of watching a 23-year-old drive an hour and change to see me in a car with a check engine light on, knowing exactly why, and being unable to do one single thing about it. The money came on the 11th of March. I paid that loan off on the 12th. The payoff was $23,600 and change, because she had been paying on it for 6 months at 15.9% and had barely touched the principal, which is what that rate does. I called a lender myself and paid it over the telephone with a man named Terrence who had no idea what he was participating in. Then I called my daughter. I said, "Simone, I need you to come home this weekend." She said, "Daddy, is everything okay?" I said, "Everything is fine." There is something about that Focus I have to say. It was gray, and it was a 2011, and it had 188,000 miles on it and a dent in the rear quarter panel that was there when she bought it. The check engine light came on within the first few weeks and stayed on. She drove that thing from Austin to Killeen and back, an hour and change each way, every single weekend for 6 months, through the winter, at night on I-35. I stood in a driveway a lot of Sunday afternoons watching my daughter drive away in that car, and I did not know why she had it. I thought she had made a bad decision with money. I thought about offering her something, and I did not have anything to offer. That is what I mean about the 5 months. It is not the knowing. It is going back through those Sunday afternoons afterward with the correct information. She came on Saturday. She parked that Focus in the driveway of the rental on Cedar Knob Road and came in talking about something from work. I let her get all the way to the kitchen. Then I put the payoff confirmation on the counter. She looked at it and didn't say anything for a second. Then she said, "Dad." I said, "I have known since August." My daughter put both hands over her face and stood in a rented kitchen and cried in a way I have only seen her cry twice in her life. Then she said, through her hands, "Don't be mad at me. Don't be mad at me." That is what that girl said. She sold her car for her father's hip and took a predatory loan at 23 years old and hid it for 18 months. And the first thing out of her mouth was, "Don't be mad at me." I said, "Baby, come here." We stood in that kitchen a while. There is one more thing about that Saturday. After she stopped crying, we sat at that card table for about 2 hours, and she told me the whole thing in order, the way she does. She told me she'd gotten $4,200 from a personal savings account she'd never actually had. That part had been a lie from the start, and $8,700 for the car, and that she'd been short and had put the rest on 2 credit cards. I did not know about the credit cards. That was new information at that table, and I had to get up and go stand in the kitchen for a minute. Then she told me the part that finished me. She said she had gone to Trevor first. In September of that first year, before she sold anything, my daughter drove to Round Rock and sat in her brother's kitchen and asked him to go in with her. She said she had about 9 and could get to 18. She asked him for the rest, and he told her the same thing he told me. He talked about the market and about Q3 and about being carried. She said, and then he asked me if I was sure Dad wasn't being dramatic about it. She was 23 years old, and she sat in that kitchen and heard that, and then she went and sold her car and did not tell either one of us. I bought her a car on the 18th of March. Not a Focus. A 3-year-old Lexus with 28,000 miles on it. I bought it because she would never have bought it for herself, and because I wanted her to have a thing that was better than what she gave up. She fought me about it for 4 days. She actually fought me harder than her brother has ever fought me about anything. She said it was too much. She said she didn't do it to get something. I said, I know you didn't. That's the whole reason. I should tell you a little about Simone's own life beyond what she's given to this family, because it would be easy to make her sound like nothing more than a car she sold and a loan she hid, and that isn't the whole of who she is. She's been with a man named Julian Farrow for about 2 years now, a school teacher in Austin, quiet and steady in a way I find myself grateful for every time I meet him. He came to Killeen with her twice that first winter, both times helping without being asked, once fixing a leaking faucet in that rental without my even mentioning it was broken, once simply sitting with me for an afternoon while Simone ran errands, talking about nothing in particular, the kind of nothing that turns out, afterward, to have mattered. I asked her once, that spring, why she'd never told Julian about the car, about the loan, about any of it, until well after the fact. She said, because I didn't want him to think that's what our family does. I didn't want him to think we ask each other to sacrifice things and don't say thank you. I sat with that for a long while after she said it, because I understood exactly what she meant, and I understood that she'd learned to hide financial strain the same way I had, quietly, alone, out of some inherited instinct that asking for help is itself a kind of failure. I don't know that I'm proud of having passed that particular lesson down to her. I know that I recognize it completely. There is one more thing, and she does not know about it, and she is not going to for a long time. There is a trust. Yvette Solano set it up in April, and it is irrevocable, and it is funded with $275,000, and Simone Kendrick is a beneficiary, and she does not know it exists. I did not tell her, because I have watched what money does when a young person knows it is coming. She is 25 years old and works at a nonprofit for $43,000 a year doing development work for a housing organization, and she is good at it, and she loves it. I am not going to be the reason she stops. She will find out when she is 35, per the terms, or when I die, whichever comes first. There is a version of the trust conversation with Yvette that I should describe, because she pushed back on me and she was right to. She asked me in April whether I was making a permanent decision inside of 6 weeks of a large deposit. I said probably. She said, Mr. Kendrick, I do this for a living, and the number of people who restructure an estate in the 90 days after something happens to them and then come back to me in 2 years is very high. I said, all right, then build it so I can't change it. She said, that's the point. The trust for your daughter is irrevocable because you want that protected from you. The will is a will. You can change a will any Tuesday you want. Then she said, and I would like you to come back and look at it in a year. I went back in April of this year. I sat in that office and read the whole thing again with 12 months on it. I did not change one word. Trevor is not in that document. He is not in my will either. I want to say something about that, because I've been asked about it by the 2 people who know, and both of them asked me the same way, carefully. I have changed my mind about it twice. Once in December, on a Sunday, when he called and I took it and he sounded bad and we talked for 10 minutes about nothing, and I hung up and sat there and thought, he is 32 years old and he is going to be 62 one day, and I will be dead. And once in February, when Simone told me he had asked her whether Dad ever talks about him. Both times I got as far as writing myself a note about calling Yvette. Both times I did not call. I did not disinherit my son to punish him. I disinherited my son because I have watched what my money does to him. I put 2 years and 9 months and $77,000 into a house he could not afford, and it did not make him careful. It made him comfortable. And he flew to Tulum 12 days after telling his father he was carrying a lot. That is not a moral failure that money fixes. That is a moral failure that money feeds. If I leave that man money, he will be 4 to 5 years old with a boat and no idea, and there will be nobody left to say no to him, because I will be dead. So the answer is no. And it is not a punishment. And I have never been able to explain that to anybody in a way that sounds like anything other than a punishment. Darlene married Gareth Loomis in October. I know because Dolores told Simone, and Simone told me at a kitchen table, because she does not keep things from me anymore. I said, all right, and asked her about her job. That woman is 56 years old and married to a man who sells insurance in Killeen, and she has half the equity of a house on Larkspur Street. I do not wish her badly. I want to say that, and I want it believed, and I understand that a man saying it on the internet is not the most convincing thing in the world. She moved 9 times for me. She had 2 children with me. She sat in a hospital in Landstuhl in 2004 when I had something else entirely, and she did not sleep for 2 days. And she stood in a kitchen on the other side of a wall I built and said I was useless while I was 6 days out of an operation. And both of those women are the same woman, and I have not made that fit, and I am not going to. I sold the house on Larkspur Street. That was in the settlement, and it had to go, and it went in September. I want to describe one thing about that day. I walked through it before the closing, just me on a Tuesday morning with the keys in my hand. I stood in the front room where the couch was, and I looked at that wall. I framed it in 2006 with a man named Cornelius Redding, who I worked with at the motor pool and who is dead now. 2 weekends. We did it wrong the first time and had to take the top plate off and redo it, and we laughed about that for years. I put my hand flat on that wall for a second, and then I went outside and closed the door and gave the keys to the agent. I bought a place in Nolanville in October. 3 bedrooms, 1 story, no steps. I paid cash for it, which I have never done for anything in my life, and the closing took 19 minutes, and I kept waiting for somebody to hand me a payment book. Simone helped me move, her and 2 men from the VFW that Sherman sent without asking me, one of whom is 71 years old and carried a box spring, and I could not stop him. There is a room in that house I have not put anything in. 3rd bedroom. It has a bed in it and nothing else, and I told Simone it was a guest room, and she looked at me and did not say anything. She knows what that room is for. I know what that room is for. It has been empty 14 months. That was deliberate. I picked a house with no steps at 61 years old, and if you had told me at 4 to 9 I would be doing that, I would have laughed at you, and now it is the single smartest decision I have made in 10 years. There is one more thing I did with that money, and it is the only part of any of this I am unreservedly glad about. I gave $90,000 to that VFW post on Rancia Avenue. Not to the post exactly. It is in a fund, and the fund pays a full-time accredited veteran service officer, and there is one now, 4 days a week, at a desk with a door in the office instead of a folding table by the bar. His name is Dario Nunez, and he is 39, and he did 8 years, and he has filed 130 claims in 11 months. Sherman Odom still comes in 3 days a week for free and works next to him and will not take $1, and I have stopped arguing with that man about it. I did not put my name on it. It is named after Cornelius Redding, who helped me frame a wall in 2006 and who died in 2020 at 59 years old with a claim that was never filed. I should tell you more about Cornelius, because a wall and a headstone is not enough to hold what that man actually meant to me. We met at the motor pool in 1996, both of us buck sergeants at the time, him already 12 years in and considerably better with a torque wrench than I would ever become, though he never once made me feel small about the gap. He was from a small town outside Tuskegee, Alabama, and he used to say that fixing trucks was the only job he'd ever had where nobody cared what color he was, because a busted transmission doesn't have an opinion about anything except whether you know what you're doing. Cornelius retired 2 years ahead of me and stayed in Killeen, same as most of us do, working part-time at an auto parts store mostly because he said retirement made him restless and he liked having somewhere to be. We framed that wall together in 2006 on 2 consecutive Saturdays, and I mentioned already that we did it wrong the first time. But I didn't tell you the specific way we did it wrong, which is that Cornelius insisted on measuring everything twice, and I insisted we were burning daylight, and we split the difference by measuring once and hoping, and the top plate came out crooked by nearly an inch. and we had to tear the whole thing back down on a Sunday morning with considerably worse humor between us than we'd started with the day before. He never let me forget it. For 13 years, any time I mentioned being in a hurry about anything, Cornelius Redding would say, "Measure twice, Kendrick," and grin like it was the first time he'd ever said it, even though by the end it was closer to the thousandth. It came out afterward. I only learned this going through some of his papers with his widow, helping her sort out what needed sorting. That Cornelius had a claim of his own sitting unfiled, a back injury from a different deployment entirely, that he'd never once gotten around to pursuing because, in his widow's words, he always said there'd be time to deal with it later. There wasn't. That's part of why I put his name on that office door instead of my own. A man who taught me to measure twice never once measured his own situation at all, and I have carried that particular irony with me since the day I first heard it. I turned 61 this past spring, and I want to be honest that it landed differently than any birthday before it. Darlene and I had always talked, in the vague, comfortable way long married couples do, about what our later years might look like, a smaller house eventually, maybe a camper for the two of us to see some of the country neither of us had ever gotten around to seeing on the Army's schedule instead of our own. None of that future exists anymore, not in the shape we'd imagined it, and I've had to build an entirely different version of what the remainder of my life is actually for. I don't think I built a worse version, in the end, though there are mornings I would trade every bit of what I've rebuilt to have the other version back instead, without a moment's hesitation, if such a trade was somehow available to me. It isn't. So I've done the only thing left to do, which is get up every morning at 5:30, same as I always have, and see what the day actually requires of me instead of what I once assumed it would. The hip is good. That is the thing nobody expects at the end of this. It works. There was a morning in June of this year that I want to put in, because it is the only thing in 2 years that got me. I got up at 5:30, the way I always have, and stood up off the edge of the bed and walked to the kitchen and started the coffee. I was about halfway through pouring it when I realized I had not thought about it. Not one time. Not the hip, not the first 4 steps, not the thing I used to do with my foot, not any of it. I had gotten out of a bed in Crosser House, and my body had not asked me for anything. I stood in a kitchen in Nolanville with a cup in my hand at 5:40 in the morning, and I had to put it down on the counter. 17 years. That is what got taken, and I did not fully understand the size of it until it came back. I walk about 3 miles a day, and I have not used a cane since February of last year. I got up off the floor last month without thinking about it, and then sat back down because I wanted to see if I could do it again. 17 years of that joint getting woes, and 19 months of hell, and $58,000, and it works. And if I had been able to pay for it years earlier, I would have gotten those years back. That is the actual cost of a 20% rating on a form. I think back, sometimes, to that exact moment on the couch, 6 days out, my wife's voice carrying through a wall I built with my own hands, the specific relief in that laugh. I didn't know, lying there looking at a ceiling I'd once climbed a ladder to install, that I was about to spend the next 2 years learning things about my marriage, my children, and my own capacity to keep going that I don't believe I could have learned any other way. I know it now. 5 months. That's the entire distance between the version of that spring where I write a check for $58,000 and everyone in my family keeps the life they already had, and the version that actually happened, where a wall carried a sentence 11 feet, and a government check arrived 5 months too late to stop anything it might have stopped. I have made my peace with the fact that I will never know which version was actually coming, regardless of the money. Maybe Darlene leaves either way. Eventually, once she'd found Gareth and decided what the next 30 years were going to look like. Maybe Trevor says no to $18,000 whether or not I ever had to ask, because the asking itself was always going to be the real test, and money arriving sooner wouldn't have changed what kind of man showed up on that back porch. I don't know. I have stopped needing to know. Most days. Most days. Here is what I would leave you with. And there are 2 things. The first one is practical, and if you are a veteran or you love one, this is the only part of this that matters. Go and see a veteran service officer. They are free. They are at the VFW and the American Legion and the County Veterans Office, and they are not the VA. They work for you, and there are about 11,000 of them in this country, and most veterans have never spoken to one. I was rated at 20% for 17 years. 17 years. And a man named Sherman Odom looked at my file for about 9 minutes in a room with folding chairs in it and said, "Otis, who rated you at 20%? That question was worth $486,000, and it took 9 minutes, and it was free, and I could have asked it more than a decade earlier. I did not ask, because I did not think I was the kind of man who needed help with a form. 26 years of signing for other people's equipment, and I could not walk into a room with folding chairs and ask a question about my own paperwork. The second thing is about my son, and it is not what people expect me to say. Everybody who hears this wants to know when Trevor turned. They want a moment. They want to know what happened to that boy. And the answer is that nothing happened to him, and the turn was not a turn. I paid for everything he ever had. 0 debt out of Texas A&M, a car at graduation, a co-signed mortgage he did not qualify for, and $23.50 a month for almost 3 years toward a house he lived in like he had earned it. And then I asked him for $18,000 one time on the back porch in August. That was the first time in 32 years that man had ever been asked to give something up. The first time, at 32 years old. And he was not able to do it. I want to be fair to what Trevor was actually dealing with in his own career, even though I don't think it excuses what he did on that back porch. Pharmaceutical sales in the years right around then had gotten considerably harder than when he'd started. Territories consolidated. Quotas raised without matching increases in the actual size of the physician panel's representatives were expected to cover commission structures rewritten twice in 3 years in ways that mostly benefited the company. I know this because Simone told me, and because I looked some of it up myself afterward, wanting to understand whether my son had been lying to make himself sound sympathetic or telling me something genuinely true about a hard industry. It was true. The industry had gotten harder. His numbers probably were down. None of that required him to say no to his father the way he said it, wrapped in market language instead of a plain sentence, and none of it explains a bottle of wine in an ice bucket 12 days later. But I think it's worth saying, because I don't want this story to sound like my son was simply lazy or simply comfortable. He was under real pressure that spring, in a career that had genuinely gotten harder. He chose, under that pressure, to protect his own liquidity instead of his father's hip. Those two facts sit next to each other without canceling each other out, and I've had to learn to hold both at once instead of picking the version that makes my own anger simpler. I have had 2 years to be angry about that, and what I have arrived at instead is much worse, which is that I did that. I built a man who could not do it. One tuition payment and one car and one mortgage transfer at a time, over 32 years, out of love. And every single one of those decisions was a decision of a father who wanted his son to have it easier than he did. Simone had the same childhood and turned out different. People bring that up every time I say this. They are right, and it does not settle it. It makes it harder. I have thought about the differences, and there are two, and neither one of them is a comfort. The first is that she was second. By the time Simone was 15, I was 50 and tired, and there was less money. And I said no to her more often, and I said it without agonizing about it, and she got the version of me that had run out of the energy to make everything easy. The second one I only worked out this year. Trevor watched me get everything I wanted. He was 11 when I made Sergeant First Class, and 18 when I made Master Sergeant, and 21 when we paid that house off. Every single thing he saw his father do worked. Simone was 12 when the limp started. She grew up watching a man lose something slowly and keep going to work about it anyway. And she is the one who sold her car. I do not know what to do with that either. My daughter sold her car. My son gave me 10 minutes about liquidity and flew to Mexico. And the only difference I can find, when I lay their lives side by side, is that Simone was the second one. And I was tired by then. And I said no to her more often, because I had less to give and less patience. And she got the worst version of me. She got the worst version of me, and she turned out better. I do not know what to do with that. I have been sitting with it for 2 years, and there is nothing to do with it. And if there is a young father listening to this with a small child and some money, I do not have advice for you. I have got a warning, and it is not the same thing. Simone knows most of what I've told you here, though not all of it came from me directly, and not all at once. She was the one who finally asked, about a year in, whether I'd ever told Trevor exactly what I heard through that wall, the specific word, useless, not just the general shape of the divorce. I told her I hadn't, and probably wouldn't, because it wasn't information that would change anything for him, only hurt him in a place that had nothing to do with his own choices. That's very generous of you, she said, in a tone I couldn't fully read. It's not generous, I told her. I'm not protecting your mother. I'm just not interested in handing your brother one more thing to be angry about that isn't actually his to carry. Simone thought about that for a while, sitting at my kitchen table in the house in Nolanville, and then she said something that I think closes this out better than anything I could come up with myself. I think that's a difference between you and both of them. Dad, you keep deciding what's actually necessary to say, instead of just saying whatever would make you feel better in the moment. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't, entirely. I just try to keep doing it. If you got something out of this one, subscribe before you go. That is the one that actually matters. I put a new story up every single day, and the next one is already written. Hit like on the way out. It genuinely helps this reach the people it is for. And in the comments, tell me the honest thing, not the kind one. My son is 32. He lost the house, and he has called 4 times in September. Should I have given him the $9,500? I read every single one of them.